Hi, and welcome to the second lecture of morphology. So, just as a reminder of what we talked about in the last video, we looked at different morphological rules with respect to prefixes and suffixes of English, and we compiled a list of a couple of different prefixes and suffixes that we saw towards the last class. So, here are a couple of the morphological rules that we saw with an illustrative word, and we also looked at morphological ambiguity with respect to things like unlockable, where you can have two different meanings to the word depending on whether you attach the prefix un first or the suffix able first. And we also looked at drawing morphological tree structures such as this one for the derivation 1, where you get the meaning able to be unlocked, and here is a different tree structure for the meaning of unlockable, not able to be unlocked. Now, one thing that we can talk about with respect to morphological ambiguity is that, well, not all words exhibit this kind of morphological ambiguity. Not all words have two different ways of actually deriving it. So it's not always the case that if you see a prefix and a suffix, you can always attach the prefix first and then attach the suffix. So here's an example of how there's only one way of deriving redoable, even though redoable, just like unlockable, has a prefix and a suffix. The only possible way of doing redoable is to have redo and then attach able to it, right? So you attach do, you take do, you attach re to it, and then you get a verb, and then you attach able to it and you get an adjective. The other structure where you take do and able and then you attach re to it is not a possible structure. The reason is because re, the prefix, is actually looking for a verb to attach to and not an adjective. And therefore, when you attach do and able at the beginning, what you derive doable is actually an adjective and not a verb. And therefore, re will not be able to attach to doable and your derivation will fail. So as you can see, not every structure is ambiguous, and there could only be one way of deriving things for a lot of different words. So this is something that I want you to keep in mind when you do your morphology assignment, but also when you look at morphology and morphological rules in general, right? So let's move on to the topic of this week. This is compounding. And compounding is a phenomenon that's a word formation process that's very, very common in English. If you look at the history of English, if you look at Old English, Middle English, you can see that many of the words in English are compounds. And the difference between prefixation and suffixation and compounding is that in compounding, you combine two free morphemes together. So here are some examples of compounds in English. This is blackboard, dollhouse, jumpsuit, steamroll, whitewash, breakdance, nationwide, and blue-green. So here I have a note about compounding and spelling, and very often my students get confused about what is a compound. So you can have compounds that are written as a single word, so you can have compounds like mailman, but you can also have compounds that are hyphenated like blue, green, and spoon feed, etc. Sometimes compounds can also be written as two separate words. So here are some examples of compounds in English written as two separate words: doghouse, fire engine, oil well, and yes, the last one is actually a compound: television repair specialization exam. Now, how do we know that there are words that are written separately, but these are compounds and not, phrases, for example? The main indication of compound is stress, right? The placement of stress, primary stress in English. In a compound, the main stress is always on the first word. So you say blackbird, doghouse, fire engine. You don't say blackbird, doghouse, fire engine with the stress on the second word. And then in the phrase, the main stress is always on the last word. So a black car, an old house, a broken engine, an empty well, etc. Right? And with the phrase, obviously, you can have the adjective is actually modifying the main noun, which is car, and you can also have a determiner in front of the adjective, like a or an. Now, when we talk about morphological rules and compounding, we can actually understand prefixation and suffixation a lot better if we look at the different kinds of compounds that exist in English. So let's look through a variety of compounds that we can have in English. We can have noun-noun compounds in English. So this is dollhouse, where you have two nouns combining together to create another noun. And you can also create a rule, just like how we did for prefixation and suffixation, where you get n plus n, the resulting compound is a noun. Here you can have an adjective and a noun compound. The resulting word is a noun. So this is the word blackbird. Black is an adjective and N is a word. And you can have the resulting word as a noun. Here is a verb noun compound. This is jumpsuit. Jump is the verb to jump. And the noun suit is a noun. And jumpsuit is a noun, something that you wear. Spoon feed, written with a hyphen, is a noun verb compound. You have a noun, which is spoon, and then you have the verb feed, and then you get the verb spoon feed. You can have adjective and verb compounds. So you can have white and wash to get whitewash, right? And so you see that you have an adjective and a verb, and then you get a verb. And then you have verb-verb compounds like break and dance. So you have two V's, and then you get another verb. You have nationwide, which is a noun and an adjective compound. Nation is a noun and wide is an adjective, and then you get an adjective nationwide. And the last of the compounds is adjective and adjective compounds. So this is blue-green, where you take two adjectives and combine them together to get another adjective. So here is a list of all the rules that we just saw for compounding. And what you can see is there is a pattern that is actually emerging with respect to compounding. If you look at the right-hand side, you can see that the left-hand side of the rule is very similar to the rightmost end of each of these compounding rules, right? So in a noun-noun compound, the resulting word is a noun. But in an adjective-noun compound, the resulting word is a noun, not an adjective. So you can see that the category or the part of speech of the word that is derived by the compound, the resulting word of the compound is actually the same part of speech of the second word of the compound, right? So in this case, house, bird, suit, feed, wash, dance, wide, and green. So the crucial observation is that the category of the compound was always the same as the category of the last word. So in some sense, you can see a blackbird is a kind of bird, not a kind of black, right? So that's what we are trying to establish over here. And nationwide, again, is a kind of wide, right? Not a kind of nation, for example, right? It's across the nation, right? In that sense of wide. What we can do is we can now remove all the different rules that we saw with prefixation and suffixation and with compounds, and we can have one rule to kind of rule them all, right? To have an analogy from Lord of the Rings, and this is that in a compound, the category of the compound is copied up from the category of the right-hand side of the word. So you can have the meaning of a word derived from the head of the word, right? And head of the word is basically the right-hand side of that, right? So for blackbird, the head of the word is bird. Jumpsuit, the head of the word is suit. Spoon feed, the head of the word is feed, and so on and so forth. And so if you have X and Y, X is the head of Y if X is a part of Y, right? A bird belongs to blackbird, and the category of Y is copied up from the category of X, right? And as you can see, the head contributes to the core meaning of the compound. So blackbird is a kind of bird, a jumpsuit is a kind of suit, breakdance is a kind of dance. We call this rule the right-hand head rule. Very often it's easy if you remember right-hand head rule, right? Right-hand head rule. That's what I want you to remember. Extend your right hand, put it on your head. That's the only rule that you need to remember for prefixation, suffixation, and compounds, right? But most importantly for compounds, that the head of the compound is the rightmost morpheme, right? So we don't need separate rules for each of the different compounds that we saw. We only need the right-hand head rule. But now we can also rethink what we saw from prefixation and suffixation, all these different rules that we looked at in last lecture, and we can kind of make these couple of observations. That when you look at prefixation, prefixation can never change the category, right? So here are prefixes re, un, the two kinds of un, and you can see that the prefixation never changes the category of the word. So the category of the word on the left-hand side and the rightmost element is the same, we, a, and we. The second observation is that suffixation could sometimes change the category of the word, but sometimes need not. So with respect to player, it changes the category. Happiness, it changes the category, right? So here are some cases where the category is actually changed. And so the creep proposal is that, well, maybe affixes also have some kind of part of speech, right? So er, the suffix, is a category noun, and it means one who does X. Ness is the category noun, state of being X, etc. Able is an adjective, able to be X'd, etc. And so what we can now do is we can actually use the right-hand head rule to get rid of all the rules for prefixation and suffixation. Right? And what you do is basically you say if you add an adjective and a suffix, the category of the resulting word is that of the resulting suffix, right? So what the category of the suffix is going to determine what the part of speech of that word is. And so basically we will have rules such as this, right? The right-hand head rule says if you have a prefix re attaching to the verb do, just copy up the part of speech of the verb all the way up to the top, right? We will not worry about what the category of prefixes are, just because it doesn't really matter. Prefixes are non-consequential to determining the category of the resulting word, so we won't worry about that. And therefore, now we don't need a separate rule, which was re plus we gives you a we. All that it says is the right-hand head rule says the word must be a verb because the second part of that particular word is a verb. So here is a summary of affixes and heads. There are three consequences. We need not have separate rules for prefixation and suffixation. The second consequence is that a prefix can never be a head and the suffix can be a head in the right-hand head rule. We call the two different kinds of affixes inflectional and derivational affixes. So there are some kinds of affixes like er, one kind of er, right, like the adjective kind of er, the de, which is the past tense morpheme in English, and the z, which is the plural morpheme. These are inflectional affixes, versus derivational affixes such as able and ing, etc. have different properties. The properties with inflectional affixes is that they don't affect the category of the resulting word, and they never fail to combine with the word because of its meaning. You can always create a past tense if you are attaching it to a verb. You can always create a plural if you're attaching it to a noun. But with derivational affixes, they can change the category of the word. They don't always have to, but they can. And they sometimes fail to combine with words because of the meaning associated with that particular word. So what we call plural morphemes, past tense morpheme, and the er morpheme with adjectives is inflectional morphology, and the other kind of affixes are derivational affixes. So here's an example of inflectional and derivational affixes in English. Inflectional affixes are things like er for adjectives, the d for past tense, and z for plural marker. And the derivational affixes in English are the er for verbs. So as you can see, homophonous morphemes can have two different properties, for example, and all the other suffixes such as ness and able and in, etc. And also some of the prefixes that we saw. Now, remember when we talked about child language acquisition, we talked about the morpheme ordering constraint with the example that I showed you, where children who were asked to do some experiments in a child language acquisition lab were given things like mouse eater versus mice eater, but all the children said cookies, cookie eater and not cookies eater. And we said that this is actually the morpheme ordering constraint, and we can actually come back to this in morphology. So this is the same morpheme ordering constraint from the child language acquisition lab. What the morpheme ordering constraint says is that there are separate rules as to what morphological affix you can attach to a bond morpheme, to a root of the word. So the morpheme ordering constraint for inflectional affixes says that you cannot attach an inflectional affix after a derivational affix has been attached to the word. So you can't say something like do a bull z, right? Do a bull d, right? With the past tense, right? That's not possible because once you attach a derivational morpheme, you cannot attach an inflectional morpheme after that. But if you, so you can, sorry, I completely said that the opposite way, right? So let me rephrase what I was saying. So once you attach inflectional morpheme, you cannot attach a derivational morpheme, right? So you cannot say cat's a bull, right? Because once you attach the inflection, that particular word is no longer acceptable and cannot have any more suffixes attaching to it. But if you have a derivational morpheme, you can have an inflectional morpheme after that, right? So you can have playing and then make that into played, etc., right? So here's an example of the morpheme ordering constraints. You can have bakers, but you cannot have tallerness, right? So bake, to bake from the verb, baker, which is a noun, and then the z, which is your plural marker. But you cannot do taller, which is your er for adjective, and then attach ness to it, right? So tallerness, right? So that's not a possible option because after attaching and the derivational, the inflectional morpheme, you cannot attach the derivational morpheme. So let me rephrase what I said about the morpheme ordering constraint. You can attach a derivational morpheme and then attach an inflectional morpheme. But once you attach an inflectional morpheme, you cannot attach anything else, like a derivational morpheme. All right? So that's really where I want to wrap up this lecture. I also have some extra slides in here with respect to infixes, right, which is an affix that is inserted into a morpheme. And as I said, well, there are some examples of infixation in English, but English is really not a language with many infixes. So we will not be talking a lot about this. And I have some observations in here if you're interested in reading, and some constraints on English infixation. Then I also have another morphological process called reduplication, where again, this is not very common in English, but in English we have limited versions of this, like she's reading a book, not just a graphic novel, where you're kind of treating the graphic novel as a book with a lot of pictures and not a book with a lot of text, right? And then I also have a note about internal change, which is also called as Ablaut. People who have studied German or Germanic languages will know a lot about Ablaut, which is where you have a speech sound being changed because of an internal environment, phonological environment. So you can say speak and spoke, write and wrote, choose and chose, right? And so these are cases of umlaut, and this has to do with morphology again with respect to tense marking. And yes, so next week we will get into the morphology section.